When we look at the tactics being used in Palestine, then we can draw some very clear, direct lines between what's happening there and what's happening with us. And we also can begin to think forward and really use an exercise of like prediction and imagination to hypothesize about what is coming next. I was thinking is it's kind of funny, but really it's not funny. It's really quite a shame. I grew up just like most people in the U.S. You have 12 years of primary education, really 13 or 14 if you include pre-K or kindergarten. And I was just thinking about the fact that, when I walked across that stage at graduation, just reflecting back like at how little I had learned to spend that amount of time in an educational institution and come out knowing so little about myself as a human being, as an individual, so little about the world around me, so little about this land that we all belong to, so little about this nation that we are citizens of, so little about my history and my heritage. And that's especially the case if you're black or indigenous or brown or any person of color. And so it's just really, it's mind boggling to think about like the amount of effort it takes to spend so much time and offer so little to children at that. Just how that's a reflection of the values of the society. And so I was really reflecting on like things going on in the world, and it brought me to think about that because I was thinking about the fact that like right now when I picture what's happening to Palestinians, I now have a visual map in my head of Israel, of Jerusalem, of East Jerusalem, of the West Bank, of Gaza. And I didn't have that before. And it made me think about the fact that like a lot of my understanding of the world has come through learning about it through imperialism, right? So other than the things that I studied in history about Europe and things like that, in terms of like current events throughout my lifetime, I've learned about the world largely through the wars and the conquests that have been pursued by these colonizers, whether it be U.S. colonizers, U.K. colonizers, all the colonizers. And so, you know, I have this visual map in my head of of Palestine and the occupied territories. And I thought back like of previous conflicts that have happened, and I guess it's a sign of growth because when I think back to like Iraq, the Iraq War, I really don't have that visual map. I know generally where it is, but I don't know much about the geography. Even Afghanistan, I don't really know. Iraq in particular, when I think about Iraq, I think about, like geographically, I know two places. I know Baghdad, which is the big city. And then the other place I know is probably a place that a lot of other people know and may not even realize that it's a city. And the name of that city is Abu Ghraib. And in looking at what is happening today with Palestinians, somehow I just went on this thought exercise and it led me back to Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib is the name of a city. I believe it's to the west of Baghdad. It's a much smaller city. But most of us, when we think of Abu Ghraib, especially those who are over like 35, when you hear that name, you probably automatically have some images that come to mind. And those images are the images that were captured and leaked from Abu Ghraib prison, where Iraqis and other innocent civilians were rounded up, tortured, humiliated, and it was all a large percentage of it was caught on film for the amusement of the CIA and the U.S. military, and those photos were leaked. And for those who saw them, they are etched in your memory. During that time, I remember, paying very close attention and looking at that stark imagery and started to look into like, well, what else is happening? What's behind it? And I remember seeing stories start to come out that go beyond just what happened in Abu Ghraib, and it pointed to a larger policy among the U.S. They had this idea of extraordinary rendition, is what they called it. And this is what they tend to do, these colonizers. They come up with a name that sounds like some science exercise or some, complex thing, but really it's kidnapping. Extraordinary rendition is this process that, the CIA and other agencies and the military would use to basically grab people off the street who they had some loose suspicion might be maybe connected to some so-called terrorist activity, and then they would take them to one of their many black sites, these dark sites where it was kind of off the record interrogation, where they were not bound, according to them, by international law, and they could torture people for information. And this is when stories started breaking about the practice of waterboarding and sensory deprivation and things like that. And I remember thinking at that time that it won't be long before this shows up in the hood. And at that point in my development of my worldview, I really was beginning to fully grasp that the things that happen abroad, are often a testing ground for what ultimately will be used domestically, especially against black people, especially against people who are struggling for self-determination. And the thing is, when I was thinking about it back then, I was really looking at it as like, okay, somewhere down the line, there is a future where these tactics will be used. And I realized, it didn't take 20 years. It didn't take 10 years. It didn't take 5 years. At the time that the scandal and story broke out with Abu Ghraib, at the time where it was being leaked and exposed that the CIA was involved in these extraordinary renditions, these kidnappings and torture schemes, at that same time, in Chicago, they were planning to convert a warehouse into a dark site where they could kidnap people off the street and bring them in for interrogation without an arrest, with no paperwork. And this was at Holman Square. Holman Square opened up in August of 2004, just 4 months after the scandal broke around Abu Ghraib. It was a dark site in Chicago where a warehouse was converted into an interrogation center, and over the course of 11 years, somewhere around 7,350 people were brought through Holman Square. Only 67 of them, less than 1% of them, was actually given the opportunity to speak to an attorney. Sometimes people would be held there for days. Sometimes it was just a matter of hours, but they would not be charged with anything. They would just be held and questioned, and it could be for any reason. If a cop had a grudge against you, if a cop saw that you were loosely affiliated with a street organization, if a cop just needed to meet a quota and they were just rounding up people to arrest. When people were there, they were deprived of food, they were deprived of water, they were beaten, they were tased, they were, at one story I heard where they would use like a cow prod, like one of those electrical things to torture someone, and they would do these kind of ride-arounds where they would torture people in the car as they rode around. And so, reflecting on that time, there has been a long-standing tradition of the U.S. domestic policy, domestic tactics, and U.S. foreign policy and tactics being an exchange program. When we look at the tactics being used in Palestine, then we can draw some very clear, direct lines between what's happening there and what's happening with us. And we also can begin to think forward and really use an exercise of like prediction and imagination to hypothesize about what is coming next. What tools and tactics of repression and oppression are going to surface at our doorstep, in the hoods and in the streets of America soon? By the way, I'm just Mike. I'm here to offer my viewpoint in an effort to really cut through the noise, to cut through the clutter, and to present topics and reframe them in a way where we can move more quickly towards action, towards liberation. My main goal here is to use this exercise in thought and expression as a means to connect with people, to connect with you, viewers, to connect with organizations and institutions, and to really, for myself and for others, encourage people to really take stock of our lives and to curate our lives, to create worlds for ourselves where we are directly connected to the people, to the institutions, to the resources, to the values that we need to espouse and express that will bring us closer to collective autonomy, to liberation, to removing ourselves from the yoke of this colonizer system. If that resonates with you, then welcome to Drawing the Line. And so this video is going to be kind of a contextualizing of my worldview and my understanding of where things have been leading up to this moment, to offer some insight into how I'm arriving at the conclusions that I've arrived at and how I'm able to say with a great deal of confidence where I believe things are realistically heading. It's very important for me to not engage in fear-mongering and not engage in wild speculation. And so I'm going to do my best when talking about the empire's new tactics to really keep it rooted in actual observable phenomenon that we see happening in society right now that points to exactly where things are headed, so that hopefully we can together get ahead of it and move in a way where we are able to prevent ourselves from being repressed, to curtail repression, or to set ourselves up to be able to bounce back more quickly and more effectively from repression so that we can continue marching forward towards liberation. We have access to information, much more than we ever had before, about what the government is up to on a domestic and international framework. In the U.S. right now, what we are witnessing is an intense backlash that really is in response to what started in the late 2010s, around 2016, 2017 in Ferguson, and then you had around Mike Brown, and then you have Breonna Taylor, and then all of these Ahmaud Arbery, and all of these incidences that lead up to what happened in 2020, when we were forced to watch for several minutes the slow murder of George Floyd. And that really was kind of like a boiling point. And there's been these boiling points happening more and more frequently over time. We are seeing that now in response to the genocide that is taking place against Palestinians. And so it's important for us to really look at the direct connection between all of these things, because just as we are reaching the boiling point much quicker, we are seeing more and more people being mobilized, radicalized, transformed. People who can no longer and choose no longer to ignore oppression and want to be actively involved in fighting against it. We are also seeing the rapid intensification of, what is ultimately leading towards an authoritarian state, or several authoritarian states throughout the globe. And so one of those examples is with cop cities. Renee Johnston, a sister who did some research, and she put out a map of all of the cop cities projects. The one that has been kind of the focal point of organizing efforts that most people are familiar with is the Cop City project happening in Atlanta, where major corporations have gotten together under the guise of a semi-public, semi-private, kind of like nonprofit, the Atlanta Police Foundation, and they have worked in conjunction with the city of Atlanta to fund what is expected to be around a $350-400 million police, tactical training facility. And these kind of facilities are being built all over the country. In Baltimore, there was one that was built connected to a university. I think it might have been Coppin State. That was $330 million. That one is being built. And all throughout the country, there are dozens of these massive facilities. And they themselves, the builders of these facilities, have acknowledged that they're going to be doing things like they'll have a mock city where they can learn urban warfare tactics. They are going to have bomb detonation ranges, and they're going to be working on more militarized tactics. And this is in direct response to what has happened, in this country, in the last 10 years. And one of the direct connections is that the U.S. law enforcement is going to continue its relationship that it has had with the IOF through the GILI program, the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange. It says Georgia, but actually the GILI program is something that is impacted police departments all over the country. So it's not just Georgia law enforcement, but it's law enforcement officers all over the country who have this exchange programs where they go to Israel and they learn IOF tactics for dealing with essentially a colonized, marginalized, oppressed community, which exists here in a similar way that it exists in Gaza, in the West Bank. And so that direct boots on the ground connection tells us exactly the kind of tactics we're going to see. As we look overseas, we can see what's going to happen and what is happening actually here. It's worth noting that the militarization of police is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for a while. If you look at cops, if you take pictures of cops over time and look from like the 70s up to today, and you will see the change in gear. You will see that cops go from riding around in like wagons and cars to literally rolling up in tanks. And these are actual military surplus equipment that is passed off to police departments. Cops have rocket launchers and all kinds of things. And they also are using very militaristic formations. There's a tactic called kettling that the cops use, which is essentially is like a military formation when they're dealing with a mass crowd, where they bottle the crowd up into a defined space. And that allows them to be able to arrest people. It allows them to be able to come in violently and abuse people and essentially not let people out. You can see this tactic being used very recently on the campus of Columbia University, where they pushed people from the lawn where they had multiple exits into the buildings, so then they could surround the buildings and lock them in place. And on other campuses, you see them barricading and separating the students away from the outside so that they have a bottled-in population that they can then go in and victimize. You also see things like in LA, they have this thing called the crossbow technique, where a line of cops, typically the biggest, most intimidating cops, will get into the front and they create was essentially like a bow. And then a line of cops, you can consider that like the arrow, will cut through the bow and they will pick someone out and go and target that person and surround them and arrest that person and then bring them back behind the bow. It's also a method we see being used to push crowds back, creating these lines of defense where you have the big cops with shields in front, and often you'll see cops reaching over with sticks, hitting the people to drive the people back. What is different now is that we are seeing a rapid escalation of the military tactics. And it's very important for us to understand that we are going to see violence, state violence, on a scale that we have not seen before, given that they are going to be more highly trained to do what cops have always done, which is contain, suppress, oppress marginalized communities in America. When we talk about oppression in this society, there are many marginalized groups. I really don't like to engage in like oppression Olympics and trying to, well, I'm more oppressed than you, and you're more. We all are under the heel of an imperialist colonization system. We are all subjects of the colony, and we are all seeking to free ourselves from oppression. And so we have more in common than we will ever have different. And we should focus on that common ground and build coalition and cooperatives and collectives together while asserting the unique interests and needs of our community, but still recognizing that we are all part of a larger struggle, right? And yet and still, there is a very clear pattern to colonization. And one aspect of that pattern is all roads lead back to anti-blackness. And we see this happening already with the issue among Palestinians and the ongoing genocide. Now, this is not to take away from what is happening to Palestinians. In fact, in this moment, we need to center what is happening to them. They are the ones who are being bombed right now. And we are dealing with our own issues, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So focusing on one aspect of an issue does not mean that I am looking to diminish or negate another aspect of the issue, but I do want to point for the purposes of this video to the fact that there's a great deal of anti-blackness happening within the framing of the conflict that's happening, the genocide that's unfolding in Gaza and in the West Bank. For example, early on in this conflict, there was a representative of Israel, the Israeli consul general, I believe, in a panel discussion in Georgia. She said that the greatest threat to Israel right now is black youth. Black youth, all the way thousands of miles away from Palestine. She identified that the greatest threat was black youth. There was audio leaked where Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the executive director of the ADL, specifying that there is not a problem right now in terms of dealing with the actions of Israel and the perception of Israel. It's not a problem of left and right. It's a problem of the youth. And the youth have always played a huge role in pushing transformation, in taking a very hopeful approach towards society and what it can be and moving to shape society. And that's why it's very important that we do not diminish what is happening on campuses around the country, because what is happening on campuses is what has always happened throughout history. We have all of these cycles of resistance that emerge, and they are often among the youth and often among the more educated of the youth who kind of spark these movements, and then they proliferate out into the general society. Black youth in particular have long been, kind of at the center of culture, of driving culture in the society. And so it is no surprise that in the midst of all this happening, of all the different people that could be pointed at, you have Israeli officials pointing at black youth as central to the problem. And this isn't an isolated incident. You may remember back when around the time Trump was elected, people got really emboldened, and there was this big march in Charlottesville. And this march was promoted for months, and it was going to be the big, it was the Unite the Right rally. And all the fascists and all the racists of all kinds, they would stop their little bickering and infighting, and they would come together and say, hey, we're going to come together and celebrate our unique hatred of all of these different groups, and celebrate the fact that now we have someone in office who is representative of our sentiments, the way that we view the world. It is our time. It is time to take back this land, which they never lost, which actually benefits them, the vast majority of the time. But somehow they're victims, and they need to take back the land. But, that's a familiar story. Look at what's happening across seas. But while this was happening, while you see an uptick in the amount of militias being formed, in the growth of these very far-right militias, while you see mass shootings taking place where people are leaving these manifestos, and through investigation they're revealing that these people have direct ties to these alt-right groups, while all of this is taking place, racists are feeling emboldened and coming out in ways. You got, suburban white folks on their lawn with guns pointing at protesters. While all of this stuff is happening, the FBI comes out with a document and says, you know what the greatest threat to America is right now? You guessed it. Black identity extremism. That is what they decide is the greatest threat to American national security at a moment where good old-fashioned white racism was it was really having a time. And they decide that, this is the moment where we need to remind people of who the real threat is in the society. Black folks. And so there is this trend, and it's important to recognize the boots on the ground connection and the policy connection, because these two things go hand in hand. We know that what's happening overseas among Palestinians is going to come back to the black community because, again, all roads lead to anti-blackness. And black people are uniquely positioned in this society. We are at the bottom. And all of the stats that are the worst, we are the ones who are at the top of those stats. We are the ones who are most affected by all of these diseases and lifespan issues and infant mortality and the mortality of mothers during childbirth, with all the statistics. All the negative statistics, we are at the forefront of them by design. And so, because we know that all roads lead to anti-blackness in this society, then we can take a look at what's happening overseas and we can draw a very sound conclusion that, oh, that's coming over here very soon, if it has not already arrived here. And so colonization operates under this mythos that you can permanently suppress people, and the only way that that could possibly work is through relentless violence, constant violence.